a ruthless crime lord, a bankrupt father with nothing left to offer, and a quiet, overlooked daughter who never asked to be anyone's bargain chip. When Nathan Calloway walked through that door to collect a debt, nobody in that room expected what happened next. Nobody expected him to look at Charlotte Hayes, soft, uncertain, hiding behind wool and silence, and say yes. One word. No hesitation. No explanation. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told you weren't enough, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Where is it? The storm arrived before Nathan did. It always worked that way in Chicago. The weather reading the room before the room knew what was coming. By 8 o'clock on a Thursday night in late November, Lake Michigan was throwing itself against the breakwaters with the kind of rage that felt personal, and the wind that tore down West Fulton Street carried ice in its teeth. Rain hammered the corrugated metal roof of Hayes Freight and Logistics, like something trying to break through rather than fall past. The fluorescent lights inside the dispatch office buzzed and flickered with each gust, casting the stacked invoices and overdue notices in a sickly yellow that made everything look older than it was. More failed than it was. Which was saying something. Gerald Hayes had been failing for 3 years, not dramatically. Not all at once. The way a man like Gerald failed was quiet and incremental. A contract lost here, a diesel bill unpaid there, a driver who quit and wasn't replaced, a client who stopped returning calls because the trucks were running late, more often than not. Gerald was 61 years old and had built Hayes Freight with his hands and his stubbornness and not much else. And for 20 years, that stubbornness had been enough. Then the economy shifted. Then the bigger carriers moved in. Then Margaret got sick and the medical bills arrived like a second mortgage nobody had signed for. And by the time Margaret died, Gerald had borrowed from everyone he could borrow from through legitimate channels, and several channels that were not legitimate at all. The Calloway Syndicate was the last of those channels. $3.8 million. Borrowed in pieces over 14 months. The interest alone was more than the company grossed in a quarter. Gerald stood behind his desk now, with the posture of a man waiting to be hit. He was wearing the same flannel shirt he'd been wearing for 3 days. His hands were on the desk, palms flat, and they were trembling slightly. Not from cold, because the space heater in the corner was working overtime, but from the specific kind of fear that arrives when you understand that the thing you've been dreading has finally run out of patience and knocked on your door. The door opened without a knock. 2 men came through first. Large, unhurried, scanning the room with the flat professional efficiency of people who assessed threat levels, the way other people assessed the weather. They moved to opposite sides of the space without being told, and neither of them looked at Gerald directly. They didn't need to. He wasn't the variable they were calculating for. Nathan Calloway came in third. He was 38 years old and built like someone had designed him specifically to occupy space in a way other men could not. Not tall in any theatrical sense, maybe 6'2", but there was a density to him, a quality of presence that made the room smaller when he entered it. He wore a charcoal overcoat that cost more than Gerald's monthly payroll, and it was barely damp despite the downpour outside, which said something about the kind of car he'd arrived in and the kind of men who held umbrellas for him. His jaw was clean-shaven. His dark hair was cut precisely. His eyes, a gray so pale they registered as almost colorless in the fluorescent light, moved through the room with the calm, systematic attention of someone who never looked anywhere by accident. He did not sit down. He did not offer his hand. He stood in the center of the room and let Gerald understand the situation for a moment before he spoke, because Nathan Calloway had learned a long time ago that silence was a more efficient tool than almost anything else. "Gerald," he said finally. His voice was low and even, not threatening in any performative sense, which made it more threatening than if it had been. "You've had 30 additional days." Gerald's mouth moved before words came out. I know that, and I appreciate it, Nathan. I really do. There's been some issues with the receivables. A couple of our biggest accounts went to, I'm not here for context. Nathan said it without sharpness, almost gently. I'm here for $3.8 million, or I'm here to begin the process of taking what covers it. Gerald's hands pressed harder into the desk. There's nothing left to take. The trucks are collateral on 3 separate bank loans. The property has a lien. There's nothing. Nathan, I swear to you, there is genuinely nothing. Then we have a problem. The fluorescent light above Gerald's head flickered again. In the doorway that led from the dispatch office back into the small break room in the narrow hallway beyond it, there was a shadow that neither Nathan nor his men had fully registered yet, or rather had registered and dismissed the way you dismiss furniture. Charlotte Hayes had come in from the cold 20 minutes ago. She hadn't intended to be here. She'd brought her father dinner, a container of soup she'd made that afternoon because she knew he hadn't been eating, because she always knew when he wasn't eating, because taking care of Gerald Hayes had been her primary occupation since her mother died 4 years ago. She was 24 years old and had no particular plans for her life beyond the bakery counter at the small cafe 3 blocks from her apartment where she worked 5 mornings a week, and the habit of checking on her father, and the quiet domestic architecture of a life that asked very little of the world because it had learned very early that asking invited disappointment. She'd heard the cars pull up. She'd stayed in the hallway. She should have left. She knew it even then, that the smart thing was to set the soup on the break room table, slip back out the side door, and pretend she'd never been here. But her feet wouldn't move correctly. She stood just inside the doorway to the break room, her coat still on, the container of soup held in both hands, and she listened to her father try to talk his way out of something that didn't have a way out. She was wearing an oversized oatmeal-colored sweater under the coat. Her hair was dark blonde and slightly damp from the run between her car and the building. She was not a small woman. She had the kind of soft, full build she'd spent most of her life trying to hide inside layers of fabric, the result of years of mockery from people who'd decided her body was a commentary on her worth. Her eyes were a clear, pale blue, and at this particular moment they were very wide and very still, fixed on the gap between the door frame and the door itself, through which she could see most of the dispatch office. She watched her father's hands shake against the desk. She watched the man in the charcoal overcoat stand motionless in the center of the room. And then she watched something in Gerald Hayes crack open in a way she had never seen before and could not immediately categorize. It happened fast. One moment he was a man trying to negotiate, and the next moment he was a man who had run out of road and was looking wildly for something, anything, to put between himself and the drop. His eyes found the doorway, found Charlotte. She saw it happen, saw the calculation move across his face like weather. She had time to think, no, Dad, don't. She had exactly that much time before Gerald Hayes opened his mouth. My daughter, he said. Nathan's gaze shifted to the doorway. Charlotte's body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. She's 24, Gerald said. The words were coming out of him the way water comes out of something that's been punctured, not controlled, not considered, just pressure finding an exit. She's a good woman. She can cook. She can manage a household. He faltered, steadied. The desperation was so naked it was almost unbearable to witness. I'm offering her, as a wife, to you, in exchange for the debt. The room went so quiet Charlotte could hear the rain. Neither of Nathan's men moved. Neither of them reacted, which was somehow worse than if they had. It suggested this was not the strangest thing they'd heard in a room like this. Nathan Calloway did not look away from the doorway. Charlotte stood in the hallway with her container of soup and her damp hair and her oversized sweater and felt the entire architecture of her life shift beneath her feet. Her father had just offered her to a crime lord. Her father, the man she brought dinner to, the man she'd watched her mother love for 30 years, the man whose business she'd helped keep alive with weekend shifts and borrowed money she'd never asked to be repaid, had just looked at her and seen a currency. She should have been crying. She wasn't. She was too far past crying for it to be the first thing that happened. What she felt instead was a specific, terrible clarity, the sensation of seeing someone completely for the first time after years of looking at them through a fog of loyalty. Nathan took 3 steps toward the doorway. Charlotte didn't back up. She didn't know why. Maybe because she'd spent so many years backing away from things, and it had never made her safer, only smaller. She stood in the break room doorway and looked at the most feared man in Chicago and waited to find out what her life was going to cost. He stopped 2 feet from her. His pale eyes moved across her face, not the way men's eyes usually moved across her face, with the quick dismissal or the occasional cruelty, but with a focused, measured attention that felt entirely different and was somehow more unsettling because of it. He was reading something. She didn't know what. "Are you aware of what he just said?" Nathan asked. His voice was the same even, low register it had been in the other room. It was directed at her, not at Gerald. Charlotte's mouth was dry. "Yes." "And?" She almost laughed. The question was so stripped of performance, so direct, that it took her off guard. And, as though her position in this situation was something she might have an opinion about. As though anyone in this room had ever asked her before. "And nothing," she said. "He doesn't get to make that offer. I'm not his to offer." From the dispatch office, Gerald made a sound, a kind of strangled protest. Nathan did not look away from Charlotte. "No," he agreed quietly. "He doesn't." She braced for the rest of it, for the dismissal or the contempt, or some version of what the wives at her mother's book club had always delivered with their eyes, the assessment that found her wanting before she'd opened her mouth. What Nathan Calloway said instead was, "But I'm making the offer to you directly. Clear your father's debt, full settlement, the night of the ceremony. You would live in my home, carry my name, fulfill the public functions of a wife. You would not be harmed. You would not be pressured. You would be protected." He paused. One beat. "You have until I reach the door to decide." He turned and walked back into the dispatch office. Charlotte counted his footsteps. There were 9 of them. She had 9 footsteps to decide the rest of her life. She thought about the cafe, the morning shifts, the particular smell of bread in a warm kitchen. She thought about the apartment she rented above a dry cleaner on Wicker Park, where the radiator knocked all winter, and the light in the afternoon came through the west window like something almost enough. She thought about her mother. She thought about the way her mother had looked at Gerald Hayes for 30 years, with a kind of stubborn, clear-eyed love that Charlotte had always assumed she understood. She understood it differently now. "Wait," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Nathan stopped without turning. She walked into the dispatch office and stood in the center of it with her container of soup in her hands and her father staring at her with an expression she couldn't look at directly. "I have conditions," Charlotte said. Something moved in Nathan's expression. It might have been surprise. It was gone before she could read it. "Go ahead." She set the soup down on the desk because her arms were getting tired, and she refused to seem diminished by a soup container. "My father gets the debt cleared, but he gets nothing else. No ongoing support, no additional funds, nothing from you or from me after the ceremony. This doesn't become a relationship between you and him. This is between you and me." "Agreed." "I want my own space in your home, my own room, my own hours. I'm not—" She stopped, steadied. "I'm not furniture. Understood. And if I decide at some point that this arrangement isn't working, I want a clear exit. Whatever that looks like legally, I want it in writing." The silence that followed lasted long enough that one of Nathan's men shifted slightly in his peripheral position. "You'll have a lawyer present at the contract signing," Nathan said. "Your own lawyer, chosen by you." Charlotte looked at him for a moment, at the pale, measuring eyes, at the absolute stillness of a man who was never nervous and never performed and never said anything he didn't mean. "Okay," she said. It was the smallest word she'd ever spoken in a moment that large. Gerald Hayes made a sound that might have been relief and might have been grief. Charlotte couldn't tell and found that she didn't particularly care. She picked up her soup container from the desk. She would not be leaving it here. She'd made it for someone she'd thought she understood, and that person was not present in this room. She walked to the door and stopped. 5 days, Nathan said to the room in general, meaning it for Gerald. Legal arrangements. Then the ceremony. Charlotte walked out into the rain without an umbrella. She stood on the wet concrete of the parking lot and let the November storm have at her for a moment. The cold, the dark, the sound of the lake 2 miles east doing its violent thing against the shore. Her hair was soaked in under 30 seconds. The soup container in her hands was warm. These were the details she focused on, because the rest of it, the enormity of what she'd just agreed to, the image of her father's face in the moment he'd offered her like a trading chip, those things were waiting behind a door she wasn't ready to open yet. She had 5 days. She didn't know what she was walking toward. She only knew what she was walking away from, which turned out, in that moment, to be more than she'd realized she'd been carrying. The problem was this. Charlotte Hayes had accepted the terms of a man she knew nothing about. She had agreed to carry the name of the most dangerous crime family in Chicago. She had done it with her eyes open and her spine straight, and what she believed was a realistic assessment of her options. What she hadn't accounted for, what no one had told her, what nothing in Gerald Hayes's desperate gamble had prepared her for, was the possibility that Nathan Calloway had reasons of his own for saying yes. And those reasons had nothing to do with debt collection. 5 days later, standing at the back of a small civil ceremony in a room she'd never seen before, in a dress she'd bought herself because she refused to owe anyone that too, Charlotte Hayes was about to become Charlotte Calloway. The officiant was already at the front of the room. Nathan was already standing at the end of the short aisle, facing forward, hands clasped. His profile was cut and still and gave nothing away. The door behind Charlotte opened. A man she didn't recognize leaned in and said quietly enough that only she could hear, "Mrs. Calloway, there's something Mr. Calloway asked me to give you before you go in." He held out a single folded piece of paper. Charlotte took it, unfolded it. 3 sentences, written in a clean, spare hand. "You are not a debt. You are not a bargain. You are the only person in that room who came in here with any dignity, and I intend to make sure you leave with more of it than you arrived with." Charlotte stared at the paper for a long moment. Then she folded it carefully, put it in the small clutch she was carrying, and walked through the door. The paper was still in her clutch when the ceremony ended. Charlotte stood in the marble foyer of the Calloway estate 40 minutes later and tried to absorb the scale of the place without looking like she was absorbing it. The ceilings were high enough to make her feel slightly aeronautical. The floors were pale limestone that clicked under her heels with a precision that made every step feel announced. Everything was expensive in the specific way that old money is expensive. Not loud, not decorated for impression, but simply built to last in a way that most things weren't, as though the architecture itself understood it had outlived several generations and intended to outlive several more. A woman named Vera, 50-ish, silver-haired, moving with the compressed efficiency of someone who had managed complex households for decades, met them at the door and showed Charlotte to her suite on the 2nd floor without ceremony or excessive explanation. The suite was larger than Charlotte's entire apartment. It had its own bathroom, its own sitting area, a writing desk positioned beneath a window that looked out over the back grounds, and a bed with a frame made of dark walnut that Charlotte estimated weighed more than her car. "Mr. Calloway's rooms are at the east end of the corridor," Vera said, setting Charlotte's single bag. She had packed one bag, efficiently, because she refused to be the kind of person who needed to be moved in stages, on the luggage stand near the closet. "Yours are here. The kitchen is open at all hours. If there's anything specific you need, I'm reachable through the house phone on the desk." She said it without warmth and without coldness. Purely informational. Charlotte appreciated it. "Thank you," Charlotte said. Vera left without further commentary. Charlotte stood in the center of the suite and breathed. The room smelled of beeswax and something faintly floral, not perfumed, just clean in the old way, the way things smelled when they were maintained rather than masked. Outside the window, the November storm had thinned to a steady gray drizzle. The grounds beyond the glass were enormous and dark, shapes of bare trees and wet hedgerows disappearing into the kind of darkness that only existed when there was enough land to let it. She sat on the edge of the bed. Her hands were in her lap. This was, she understood, the beginning of whatever this was. She didn't sleep well that first night. Not from fear, exactly. More from the particular alertness of a body in an unfamiliar space, cataloging sounds, measuring distances, assembling a map of the new environment the way animals did when they were moved. The house had its own vocabulary of noises, pipes, somewhere below. A door, distant. Twice, footsteps in the corridor that paused outside her door without knocking. Security, she assumed, doing rounds. And twice she lay in the dark and waited for whatever came next. And twice nothing did. By 5 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and went looking for the kitchen. It was enormous, obviously. Restaurant-grade range, walk-in pantry, the kind of prep space that assumed food was being produced at volume. Charlotte stood in the center of it, in her socks, and the oversized sweatshirt she'd slept in, and looked at all of it for a moment, and then she opened the pantry and started pulling things. She needed to do something with her hands. She always had. It was the way her brain processed things it couldn't yet articulate. She moved through the world through flour and butter and heat. through the mechanics of something that had clear rules and predictable outcomes, and produced at the end something that was simply and honestly good. By 7, she had made 2 loaves of bread and a tray of cinnamon rolls. She was working on a third loaf, something dark, seeded, the kind of bread that needed to be punched down and folded. When a sound in the doorway made her look up. One of the bodyguards. She'd seen him at the ceremony, late 30s, heavy set, with a jaw like a shelf and the particular stillness of a man trained to read rooms before entering them. He was looking at the counter with the expression of someone processing unexpected information. "You made that?" he said. "Yeah." He looked at the cinnamon rolls, then at her. "Is it? Help yourself." He crossed the kitchen with a speed that was slightly inconsistent with the general gravity of his bearing, took a cinnamon roll, and ate half of it standing at the counter. Charlotte watched him. He closed his eyes for approximately 2 seconds. "That's—" He stopped, seemed to locate his professional composure. "That's very good." "I know," Charlotte said, and went back to her bread. His name, she learned over the next 3 days, was Marco. He had worked for Nathan for 11 years. He did not discuss Nathan's business, and he did not ask about Charlotte's circumstances, which she appreciated. But he began appearing in the kitchen most mornings at around 7, and after the first week he started bringing Dino, who was younger and quieter, and ate with the focused gratitude of someone who had been living on protein bars and vending machine coffee for longer than was reasonable. Charlotte fed them. She fed Vera, who accepted food with brisk appreciation and never mentioned it afterward, which was its own kind of respect. She fed the 2 additional security men whose names she learned were Sal and Benedetto, who communicated primarily in nods, but whose nods, she discovered, had a range of precise meanings once you paid attention. She was learning the vocabulary of this household the same way she'd learned everything, by watching, by being quiet, by making herself useful in ways that didn't require anyone to acknowledge her. What she did not do in those first weeks was see Nathan, not because he was avoiding her. More precisely, his life moved at a scale and pace that didn't naturally intersect with the rhythms she was establishing in the kitchen and the grounds. He left before she was awake most days and returned late. When their paths crossed, it was brief. The corridor, the foyer, once the library where she'd gone looking for something to read and found him already there, standing at the desk with a phone pressed to his ear and a look on his face that suggested the person on the other end was not enjoying the conversation. He'd looked up, nodded once. She'd taken 2 books from the shelf and left. They were managing around each other with a mutual, almost tactical courtesy that acknowledged the situation without producing any friction. And for the first 3 weeks, Charlotte told herself this was fine. This was what she'd agreed to. The arrangement. The terms. Then the invitation arrived for the Moretti reception. Vera brought it to Charlotte in the kitchen on a Wednesday morning. A heavy cream envelope with the kind of formal engraving that suggested the event had been planned for months. Inside was an invitation to a reception hosted by Dominic Moretti, head of the Moretti family out of New York, celebrating the marriage of his eldest son. Black tie. 3 weeks' notice. A handwritten note clipped to the back in Nathan's spare, clean script. "This is the first public function. I'll brief you on who will be there." N. Charlotte set it on the counter next to her mixing bowl. She stood there for a moment, flour on her hands, and understood that the 3 weeks of relative quiet had been an anteroom, and she was now being told the actual room was ready. The briefing happened that evening, in the study off the main hall. Nathan sat across from her at a low table with 2 glasses of water and a list of names Charlotte was expected to recognize. He went through them methodically. The families, the alliances, the specific hierarchies and sensitivities she needed to be aware of without ever being seen to be aware of them. He was thorough. He was direct. He spoke to her the way he would have spoken to someone competent, which Charlotte noted and filed away. When he finished, she said, "The Vitale family and the Moretti family. You said they've been in a territorial negotiation for 18 months. He looked at her. "Yes." "So Dominic Moretti hosting this reception is also a performance. Proof of stability. Proof that the Moretti operations are intact and confident enough to celebrate publicly." "That's accurate." "Which means anyone attending is implicitly endorsing his position in that negotiation." Nathan picked up his glass. "Set it down. You understand this faster than I expected." I've been managing a failing business with my father since I was 19, Charlotte said. I understand how people use social occasions to make financial statements. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly. More like a recalibration. The wives will want to evaluate you, he said. Some of them will be hostile. It comes from their own hierarchies. Don't rise to it. I'm used to people being hostile about my appearance, Charlotte said flatly. I've had 24 years of practice. He looked at her for a moment without looking away. That stops now, he said. It wasn't said with feeling. It was said the way you state a fact that has already been determined. Charlotte didn't know what to do with that, so she nodded and looked at the list again. 3 weeks later, standing in the receiving line of the Moretti Ballroom, in a deep burgundy dress she'd spent 2 days finding because she refused to be dressed by someone else or to apologize for the body she was putting into it, Charlotte held Nathan's arm and shook hands and smiled at people whose names she'd memorized and watched the room the way he'd taught her to without appearing to watch it. The remarks started within the first hour. They came from 2 women, wives of the De Luca and Ferrante families, both expensively dressed, both with the polished, aerodynamic quality of women who had been decorative assets for so long they'd forgotten there were other ways to exist. They were speaking to a third woman when Charlotte passed close enough to hear, and they were not particularly quiet about it. She's not exactly what you'd expect. No, she really isn't. I suppose he needed something, manageable, after Elena. Laughter, brief and knowing. Charlotte kept walking. Her face didn't change. Her grip on her small clutch tightened by a fraction. She went to the bar, ordered a sparkling water, and stood with it and breathed and told herself that she had survived this exact taxonomy of cruelty since she was 11 years old, and it had never actually killed her. She was still standing at the bar when Nathan appeared at her shoulder. He didn't say anything immediately. He stood next to her and accepted a drink from the bartender and looked at the room with the same flat, systematic attention he brought to everything. The 2 women by the third pillar, Charlotte said quietly, De Luca and Ferrante wives. I know. They weren't subtle. They rarely are. Charlotte turned the glass in her hand. You mentioned someone named Elena in what they said. The quality of Nathan's stillness changed in a way that was almost imperceptible. Almost. My wife, he said. Previous. She died 4 years ago. Charlotte absorbed this. I'm sorry. You don't need to be. She looked at him. He was looking at the room. His jaw was exactly the same as it always was, set, controlled, giving nothing. But the space around the word she died was different from the space around everything else he said, and Charlotte was good enough at listening to spaces to notice. She didn't push it. What happened next happened quickly. Nathan set his glass down, excused himself with a brief touch to Charlotte's arm, and crossed the ballroom with the unhurried deliberateness that was his default mode of movement. He approached the 2 women by the pillar. Charlotte watched. She couldn't hear what was said from where she stood, but she could read the room. The way the women's postures changed, the way the color left the face of the Ferrante wife, the way De Luca's wife reached for her husband's arm before remembering he wasn't standing close enough. Nathan said something else. Both women turned to look at Charlotte. Then, in the middle of the most lavishly appointed ballroom Charlotte had ever stood in front of 40 representatives of America's most powerful criminal families, Lucia Ferrante and Gianna De Luca walked across the floor, stopped in front of Charlotte Hayes, and apologized. Not graciously, not warmly, with the specific, grinding humiliation of women who understood exactly what was being extracted from them and had no choice but to provide it. Charlotte listened. Her face gave them nothing. Thank you, she said when they were done. It was 2 words. She invested neither warmth nor cruelty in them, just acknowledgement. Then she turned back to the bar. The room had heard. The room had seen. By morning, every family represented in that ballroom would know that Nathan Calloway's wife was not a target. The message had been sent in a language that community understood fluently and forgot slowly. What Charlotte had not expected was what the message cost her internally. She wasn't sure she'd wanted it. The apology, the public gesture, some part of her, the part that had been handling its own battles since childhood, the part that had learned to depend on exactly nothing, felt obscurely unsettled by the fact that Nathan had done it at all. She hadn't asked him to. She'd been managing. She thought about that on the drive home. Sitting in the back of the armored car with Nathan beside her, the city moving past the tinted windows in its nighttime blur of light and pavement, she thought about what it meant to be defended by someone who hadn't waited to be asked. It had never happened before. That was the uncomfortable truth. 24 years of walking into rooms and being measured by a set of criteria she'd never consented to, and not once had anyone positioned themselves between her and it. She kept her eyes on the window and her hands in her lap and said nothing about any of this. "You handled yourself well tonight," Nathan said. "It wasn't offered as comfort. It was an assessment." "I've had practice," she said. Different kind of room. Same kind of cruelty." He looked at her then. She could feel it even while looking at the window. She didn't turn. After a moment, he looked away, and the rest of the drive passed in silence. And the silence was not the silence of two strangers anymore, which was its own uncomfortable development. The change happened incrementally after that, the way temperature changes. Not in a moment you can point to, but in the accumulated weight of daily proximity. Charlotte continued to bake. Marco and Dino, and eventually even Sal, started appearing in the kitchen. Vera loosened by degrees, never warm exactly, but communicative in ways she hadn't been that first week. The house started to smell like food in the mornings, and Charlotte stopped feeling like a guest in a building and started feeling like a resident in a place, which was as close to belonging as she'd gotten in a long time. Nathan began appearing at breakfast, occasionally at first, then regularly. Not to talk, he ate with the efficiency of a man who regarded meals as logistical necessities, but his presence was consistent. And after 2 weeks of finding him at the kitchen table with his coffee and his phone and his precise, unhurried silences, Charlotte stopped being surprised by it. She learned things about him sideways, the way you learned about careful people. He took his coffee black and too hot, which Charlotte privately considered a character flaw. He read everything, physical newspapers, which she found slightly antiquated, and dense reports she never saw the covers of. He had a particular quality of attention when someone was speaking to him that was so absolute it occasionally made people stumble over their own sentences. He never made a casual statement. Everything he said had been considered first, which meant he said less than most people, but what he said landed with a weight that casual speech didn't carry. He was not what she had expected. She hadn't expected to think about that. She hadn't expected any of this. Not the kitchen table mornings, not the way Marco now told her things about the estate and the household that suggested she was being read as permanent, not the note she'd carried in her clutch since the day of the ceremony and read alone in her room, more times than she had any logical explanation for. She was in trouble, and she knew it. On a Tuesday in January, 63 days after the ceremony, Charlotte was in the walk-in pantry taking inventory when she heard Nathan's voice in the kitchen, talking to Marco, and she heard Marco say something low and then Nathan say, with a quietness that still carried through the pantry door, "She's good for this house." Silence. Then Marco, equally quiet, "She's good for you." Charlotte stood very still between the shelving units with a jar of dried chickpeas in her hand. She heard Nathan's coffee cup set down on the counter. She heard him walk out of the kitchen without responding, which was exactly the kind of non-answer that answered everything. She set the chickpeas down on the shelf. Her hands were completely steady. This bothered her more than shaking would have. She was still standing there, very still, very steady, when her phone buzzed in her pocket. Unknown number. Chicago area code, but nothing she recognized. She almost let it go. Some reflex made her answer. "Charlotte." The voice was immediately recognizable and immediately wrong. Wrong in the way a smell is wrong when something is turned. Her father's voice, but threaded through with something that made her stomach pull tight before her brain had finished processing the sound. "Charlotte, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I need you to come to me. Tonight. Alone. I'm in trouble. Real trouble. Not the money kind. And if you tell Nathan about this call, they'll know I talked to you and they'll—" "Who has you?" Charlotte said. Her voice was even. A pause. Then, "A man named Vincent Moreau. He says he has a message for Nathan, through you. Charlotte, please, if you don't come." She hung up. She stood in the pantry for 3 seconds. Then she walked out of it, through the kitchen and down the corridor to Nathan's study, where she knocked once and pushed the door open without waiting because there wasn't time to wait. And Nathan looked up from his desk with the flat attention he always led with, and Charlotte crossed the room and put her phone on the desk in front of him. "My father just called from a number I don't recognize," she said. "He claims he's being held by someone named Vincent Moreau. He told me to come alone and not to tell you." She paused. "I'm telling you." Nathan's eyes had gone from the phone to her face and stayed there. "Vincent Moreau," he said. The name came out very quiet, very flat, with the particular quality of a man who has just heard something that changes the temperature of the room. "You know him." "I know him." Charlotte watched his face settle into something she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled calm of day-to-day, but something underneath that calm, something older and harder and entirely without warmth. This was what the newspaper stories were about. This was what Marco meant when he occasionally said things like, "before things changed," and then stopped himself. Nathan stood. He picked up her phone. He looked at the unknown number for a moment, then at Charlotte. "You did the right thing," he said. "I know," Charlotte said. "What does Moreau want?" Nathan walked to the window. Outside, Chicago was doing its January thing. Iron gray sky, wind that didn't stop. The lake somewhere in the distance doing violence to its own shoreline. He stood with his back to her, and Charlotte could see the way his shoulders had changed, the way the set of his spine had shifted from the controlled stillness of a man managing his household to something older and more dangerous. "He wants me to understand," Nathan said, "that he can reach things I thought were protected." Charlotte absorbed this. "My father cooperated with him," she said. It wasn't a question. Nathan turned, looked at her. His pale eyes were doing the thing where they read her with the total attention that could still make her breath catch if she wasn't prepared for it. "Probably," he said. "My father offered me to you to clear a debt," Charlotte said. "And then when that wasn't useful anymore, he offered me to your enemy to create a problem." She said it cleanly, like reporting a fact. The steadiness was real. Not performed, not managed, but the actual steadiness of someone who has crossed a threshold of clarity and arrived at a place where things were simply true. "Charlotte, don't." She met his eyes. "I'm not breaking. I'm just being accurate. What happens now?" Nathan Calloway looked at her for a long moment in the failing January light, and something moved across his face that Charlotte couldn't read and he didn't name, and the silence between them had the quality of a door that was about to open onto something neither of them had fully prepared for. "Now," he said quietly, "we prepare for war." The war room was a basement. Charlotte hadn't known the estate had a basement. In 63 days of living there, she had mapped the ground floor and the second floor and the grounds with the patient. Systematic attention she brought to everything, and the basement had not presented itself as existing. Now she understood that was deliberate. The door was behind a panel in the utility corridor off the main hall, flush with the wall, no handle visible, the kind of architectural concealment that required you to already know it was there. Nathan took her down at 11 that night. The room below was nothing like the rest of the house. No limestone floors, no beeswax smell, no evidence of the careful layered wealth that sat above it. This was function without apology. Exposed ductwork on the ceiling, industrial lighting, 3 monitors mounted on one wall displaying feeds from cameras she hadn't known existed. A long table with a tactical map of Chicago's waterfront spread across it and weighted at the corners with things she didn't look at directly. 4 men were already in the room when they entered. Marco, Dino. 2 others she'd seen in the house but never spoken to. Older, quieter, with the specific economy of movement that suggested a long history of situations requiring it. Nobody acknowledged her entry with surprise. That registered, even in the midst of everything else. Nathan went directly to the table. He stood over the map and said to Marco, "Moreau's operation. What do we know about current positions?" 3 confirmed locations, Marco said. He moved to the map and pointed without touching it. The warehouse complex on the South Branch. He's used it for staging before. A property in Bridgeport under a Shell LLC that Sal traced last month. And there's a new one, Beats, a freight receiving facility near Calumet. Only started showing movement in the last 6 weeks. The call came from which cell tower? Calumet area, consistent with the freight facility. Nathan looked at the map for a moment. His hands were flat on the table edge. He was doing the thing Charlotte had watched him do at breakfast when he was reading the dense reports. The quality of stillness that meant he was processing rather than pausing. "Vincent Moreau doesn't take hostages for ransom," Nathan said. "Not to anyone specifically. He takes them for leverage, and he uses leverage quickly. If Gerald Hayes has been with him for more than 48 hours, it's because Moreau wants the exchange to happen on a specific timeline. What timeline? Charlotte asked. Everyone in the room looked at her, not with hostility, more with the recalibrating attention of people who had to adjust their model of who was in the room with them. Nathan looked at her last and longest. The Lakeshore Summit, he said. 12 days? 6 families. The Callaway Syndicate has hosted it for 11 years. If I'm managing a hostage situation going into that summit, I'm distracted. If I'm visibly distracted, I'm vulnerable. And if I'm vulnerable at the summit, other families see it, Charlotte said. Other families see it, he confirmed. She pulled out a chair and sat down at the table, not because she'd been invited to, but because standing felt like being a witness, and she was not interested in being a witness to this. She was inside it whether anyone had planned for that or not. He used my father, she said, specifically. Not a random edge, not a business associate. My father. She put her hands on the table surface, which means Moreau did his research. He knows about the debt, about the marriage, about the fact that a phone call from Gerald Hayes to me would have a specific emotional weight that a call from anyone else wouldn't. Marco was looking at her with an expression that was almost appreciative. So the question, Charlotte continued, is how Moreau knew enough about the internal details of our arrangement to know that using my father was the right pressure point. The debt is public enough if you're looking for it, but the fact that I might respond to Gerald specifically, that's more granular. That requires either surveillance or a source. The room was quiet. Nathan straightened up from the table. He looked at Marco, not at Charlotte, but Charlotte understood from the quality of that look that what she'd just said had landed in a place where it confirmed something Nathan had been calculating privately. Run the list, Nathan said. Nathan? Marco's voice had a weight in it. Run it. Marco exhaled. He went to the monitors and pulled up a document, a list of names, 15 or 20 of them, that Charlotte couldn't read from where she sat. Who has operational knowledge of the household arrangements, Nathan said. Specifically, the nature of the marriage, the terms, the reason for it. That's a short list, Dino said from the corner. Make it shorter. Charlotte watched the room move into itself, the private language of a unit that had worked together long enough to communicate in shorthand and silence. She sat with her hands on the table and her back straight and let it happen around her, and she used the time to think about her father. Gerald Hayes, she was discovering, was a more specific kind of disaster than she'd originally assessed. She had spent her life constructing a version of him that was tragic but comprehensible. A man ground down by circumstance, by grief, by the particular failure of confidence that came from watching everything you'd built dissolve. She had given him the mercy of context because he was her father, and because her mother had loved him, and because mercy was what Charlotte did when she didn't know what else to do with something that hurt. She was reassessing that mercy now. The reassessment was cold and clear and did not feel like grief. That surprised her. They worked until 3 in the morning. By the time Charlotte went back upstairs, she had sat through an operational briefing that would have been incomprehensible a month ago and had followed most of it, had contributed twice more in ways that Marco had noted in writing, and had learned that Vincent Moreau had been building a case against Nathan's Lakeshore operation for the better part of 2 years. The hostage situation with Gerald was not an improvisation. It was the final piece of a prepared strategy. She slept 4 hours, dreamlessly. The next 8 days were not quiet. Nathan moved through the estate with a different quality of attention. Not tenser exactly, but more compressed, like something that had always been contained was now contained more deliberately. He made calls she didn't overhear. He met with men who arrived in the evening and left before morning. Marco began sleeping at the estate rather than his own apartment, a detail Charlotte registered when she came downstairs at 5:30 one morning and found him already in the kitchen with coffee and the specific posture of a man who had not gone home. She fed him. She fed all of them. She baked more in those 8 days than she had in the previous month. Bread, pastry, the dense seeded loaves that required physical engagement, punching and folding and pressing because her body needed somewhere to put the energy that thinking alone couldn't burn through. On the 4th day, Nathan came to the kitchen in the early afternoon. Unusual, he was never in the kitchen at that hour, and stood at the counter while she worked and said, without preamble, "I want to tell you about Elena." Charlotte's hands kept moving in the dough. She didn't look up. "You don't have to." "I know." He pulled out a stool and sat down. This was also unusual. She had never seen him sit on a kitchen stool. He looked slightly displaced by it, like a man who understood furniture but didn't fully trust informal versions of it. Her name was Elena Reyes. We married when I was 29. It was also a strategic arrangement. Her family and mine had interests that benefited from the alliance. Charlotte turned the dough. Let the silence run. She was intelligent, Nathan said. She understood the world she'd married into, and she wasn't afraid of it. We built something that wasn't love in the beginning and became something close to it, over time. He was looking at the counter surface. She was killed in a car accident 3 years into the marriage. The accident was staged by Vincent Moreau. Charlotte's hand stopped. He was testing me, Nathan said. It came out flat. The flatness of something that had been processed until feeling was only a trace element. Wanted to know how I responded to loss, whether I'd collapse or retaliate. It was an assessment. What did you do? Charlotte asked. I responded. He said it simply. It cost Moreau 3 of his senior people and 2 significant operations on the east side. But Elena was still dead, and he was still operational. And neither of those facts changed regardless of what I did afterward. Charlotte turned back to the dough. Her hands resumed. She worked for a moment in silence, and then she said, The Moretti reception. The women who made the remarks. They mentioned her. They always mention her, Nathan said. It's a specific kind of power in this world. Remind the man of what he lost. See if it still moves him. Does it? He looked at her. Less than it did. Charlotte pressed her palm into the dough and pushed. Let the sentence be what it was. Didn't reach toward what it might mean. That evening, Nathan told her the plan. They would move on the Calumet facility on day 10. Nathan's team would approach from the South Branch waterfront, while a secondary unit created a diversion on the east side that would draw Moreau's attention and pull resources. Gerald would be extracted. Vincent Moreau would be taken into custody. Not turned over to law enforcement, not yet, but contained given certain information about who in his organization had been cooperating with federal investigators for the past 14 months, and allowed to sit with that information in a room where sitting with it was all he could do. Charlotte listened to all of it. She had a question at the end. What happens to my father after he's extracted? Nathan looked at her steadily. That depends. On what? On what we find when we get there. She didn't ask him to clarify. She understood from the quality of his tone that clarifying would be a kindness he wasn't able to offer yet, and that the kindness she actually needed right now was the truth when it arrived, rather than the comfort of a premature version. Day 10 was a Thursday. Charlotte was not supposed to be involved beyond the initial intelligence contribution. Nathan had said this without negotiating it, and Charlotte had accepted it without negotiating it, because she was not someone who confused contribution with control, and she understood that what happened in the Calumet facility that night required expertise she didn't have. What she was doing at 10:15 Thursday night was sitting in the kitchen with a phone on the table in front of her and a cup of tea she hadn't touched. And Marco, who was supposed to be at the facility but had been left behind specifically to manage her, and she understood that being managed felt different when you trusted the person doing the managing. The call came at 11:40. Marco took it. He said 4 words in response, and then looked at Charlotte with an expression that she read immediately and completely, and which still hit her like something physical despite having been prepared for its possibility. They have Gerald, Marco said. Operations contained. Nathan's asking you to come. The drive to the Calumet freight facility took 18 minutes. The rain had returned, a thin, relentless January drizzle that made the waterfront industrial landscape look like a photograph taken through wet glass. The armored SUV moved through streets Charlotte didn't know well, past the kind of infrastructure that existed to be invisible. Warehouses, rail lines, access roads, the machinery of a city's commerce that no one looked at because it wasn't meant to be looked at. The facility was surrounded by Nathan's vehicles when they arrived. Men she recognized and men she didn't move through the loading area with the organized purposefulness of a unit completing its work. Inside the main receiving warehouse, under industrial lights that made everything look slightly surgical, Nathan stood near a row of metal shelving with 2 of the men she'd seen in the war room and a third man she didn't recognize who was sitting in a chair with the particular posture of someone who had made a series of decisions that had landed them in this specific seat. Vincent Moreau was smaller than she'd expected. Not physically diminished. He was compact, somewhere in his 50s, with the shoulders of someone who had kept himself in condition and the face of someone who had spent decades being the most dangerous person in most rooms. But there was a quality of the theoretical about him that dissolved when you were actually in the same space. He was simply a man in a chair, a man who had organized the death of a woman Charlotte had never met, and had used Charlotte's own father as a mechanism, and was now sitting in a chair under industrial lighting, and that was what he was. Charlotte looked at him for a moment, and then looked for her father. Gerald Hayes was sitting on a crate near the far wall. He was wearing the same kind of flannel shirt he always wore, and he had a cut above his left eyebrow that had been cleaned but not closed, and he looked, when Charlotte crossed the warehouse toward him, like a man who'd been afraid for a long time and was now primarily exhausted. "Charlotte," his voice was rough. "Charlotte, are you hurt?" she said. "It's fine. I'm fine." He stood up from the crate with the stiffness of someone who'd been in the same position too long. "Charlotte, I need you to listen to me. There are things you don't understand about this situation, about why Moreau came to me, he approached me, I didn't seek him out. I need you to understand that." "I understand it," Charlotte said. Something in her voice made him stop. She looked at her father, 61 years old and still in the flannel shirt, still with the hands that had built something from nothing and then borrowed against it until there was nothing left, still with the face she had known her entire life, and which had, on a November night with a storm outside and a debt collector in the room, looked at her and made a calculation. "You came to me with a phone call," Charlotte said, "telling me you were in danger, telling me to come alone and not to tell Nathan." She paused. "You knew I'd tell Nathan." Gerald's face moved. "You wanted me to tell Nathan," she said. The warehouse was very quiet. She was aware of Nathan behind her somewhere, not close, giving her the space to move through this herself. She was aware of Marco near the door. She was aware of Moreau in his chair, who had gone very still. "Gerald," her voice didn't waver. "Did you go to Moreau? Or did he come to you?" Her father's mouth worked. "He approached me. I told you. He came to me with an offer, and I was in a position where I didn't have—" "What was the offer?" Silence. "What did he offer you, Gerald?" Gerald Hayes looked at his daughter, and in his face, under the exhaustion, under the residue of fear, under the familiar architecture of a man who had been failing gracefully for years and calling it circumstances, Charlotte saw it. The specific guilt of someone who hasn't done the worst thing they've been accused of, but has done something adjacent to it, and is hoping the adjacency isn't visible. "He said if I made the call," Gerald said slowly, "if I made the call and you came through with Nathan's response, he would clear what remained of the business debt. What Nathan didn't absorb. There were other creditors. He offered you money," Charlotte said. "It wasn't—" "Charlotte, I was drowning." "He offered you money to use me as bait," Charlotte said, "to draw Nathan out ahead of the summit on Moreau's timeline. And you took the offer." Gerald's hands came up. "It wasn't supposed to put you in danger." "I know what it was supposed to do," Charlotte said. "I know what it was supposed to do because I thought about it for 10 days while we prepared for tonight." She stopped. Something had pulled taut inside her chest, and she took one breath to manage it, because she would not here, not in front of these men, not in front of Moreau, let it become something other than what it was, which was grief with the sentimentality burned out of it. "You offered me to Nathan to clear a debt. Then when that stopped being useful to you, you offered me to Nathan's enemy to clear a different debt. I'm a tool you've been reaching for my entire life, Gerald, and I kept not seeing it because seeing it would have meant admitting what kind of man you actually are." The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't leave room for response. And then Nathan's voice came from behind her, quiet and even as always, and it wasn't directed at Charlotte. "Moreau." Just the name, nothing else. Moreau shifted in his chair. He looked at Nathan with the assessment of a man who had spent decades reading rooms and knew when a room had finished moving and arrived at its conclusion. "You used a civilian," Nathan said. "My wife. Twice. Through her father." He crossed the warehouse floor slowly. "You want to discuss the summit. You want to discuss what's been feeding the federal task force on the North Side operations for the past 14 months. You want to discuss why 3 of your most reliable people have been meeting with DOJ representatives in a Schaumburg office park." Something moved in Moreau's face for the first time. Fast. Gone. That last part is new information for you, Nathan said. He stopped 6 feet from Moreau's chair. It wasn't for me. I've known about the Schomburg meetings for 8 months. Charlotte watched Moreau process this, watched the recalibration happen behind his eyes. The rapid, expert reassessment of a man who had walked into a situation he'd designed and was now discovering the dimensions were different from his blueprint. You pulled this entire operation, Nathan said, to distract me from the fact that your own people are burning you. And instead of addressing your actual problem, you came after my family. He paused. That's the decision that ends things for you. Moreau said something then, low, measured, designed to be the kind of statement that shifted the ground under a conversation. Charlotte was standing 15 feet away, and she caught most of it, and what she caught made her go still. He said, "Your first wife made the same mistake you're making. She thought knowing things made her protected." The temperature in the warehouse dropped. Nathan did not move. He did not change expression. He stood with exactly the same quality of stillness he always had, and Charlotte watched his hands, and his hands were loose at his sides and open, and she understood from the very openness of them, that what was happening inside him right now was not something that showed on the surface. She also understood from the way every man in the warehouse had gone completely motionless, that what Moreau had just done was the kind of thing that a person didn't do and then have a predictable outcome. "Nathan," Charlotte said. He didn't look at her. "Nathan." She walked across the warehouse. She came and stood beside him, not in front of him, not between him and Moreau, because she wasn't interested in theatrical sacrifice, but beside him, shoulder to shoulder, close enough that he would feel her presence without having to look. He said it because he wants you to react. He wants the summit image. He wants to walk out of here and tell every family that Nathan Calloway lost his composure over a dead woman's name. She kept her voice low and her eyes forward. "Don't give him that." The moment lasted approximately 5 seconds. Then Nathan looked at Charlotte. Whatever was in his face in that moment was something she had not seen there before. She cataloged it without naming it because naming it required more certainty than she currently possessed. He looked back at Moreau. "Put him in the back room," he said to Marco. "Don't touch him. Feed him if he's hungry. I'll deal with the rest in the morning when I've spoken to the federal contacts." Marco moved. Moreau was taken from his chair with the impersonal efficiency of men who had done this before, and the chair sat empty under the industrial lights, and Charlotte stood in the middle of the warehouse with her hands at her sides, and her father somewhere behind her in the specific exhaustion of someone who had been holding themselves very correctly for a very long time and was beginning to feel the cost of it. Nathan turned to her. "Your father," he said quietly. "What do you want to do?" Charlotte looked at Gerald, who was standing near the far wall with his arms crossed over his chest, the way he always stood when he didn't know what else to do with his body. He looked old. He looked like what he was. A man who had made the choices available to him, and those choices had been bad ones, and the consequences were standing 12 feet away, looking at him with eyes that were clear and cold and finished. She thought about her mother. She thought about 30 years of a woman loving a man who, in the end, was exactly this person. She thought about whether her mother had known. She thought about the soup she'd brought to that freight office in November, warm in her hands in the rain, the effort of it, the habit of it, the 24 years of feeding someone who had looked at her and seen a bargaining chip. She looked at her father for a long moment, and then she said the truest thing she had said in years, maybe ever. And it came out so quietly it was almost private, except Nathan was close enough to hear it, and she needed someone to hear it because some truths require a witness to become permanent. "He made his choice," Charlotte said. "Both times, he made his choice." She turned away from Gerald Hayes and walked toward the warehouse door, and the cold night air of January hit her face when she pushed through it, and she stood on the wet concrete of the loading dock with the drizzle coming down in the lake somewhere in the dark east, and the sound of the city existing at its usual enormous indifferent scale. And she understood that she had just closed something, not loudly, not dramatically. The way you close a door in a house you're leaving for the last time, firmly, without looking back, because looking back is for people who are still deciding. She heard Nathan come through the door behind her. She heard him stop a few feet back, giving her the same space he always gave her, the quality of presence that was there without pressing. And then, from somewhere inside the facility, a sound. A voice, raised, carrying through the metal walls, unmistakably Marco's. and the specific urgency in it that meant something had changed in the 8 minutes since Moreau had been walked to the back room. Charlotte turned. Nathan was already moving back toward the door, phone to his ear, and the look on his face was the one she'd never seen before tonight and hoped she would not need to learn to recognize. And Marco came through the door at speed and said, in a voice stripped of everything but information, "Moreau's people. 3 vehicles on the East Access Road. They had a secondary team, and we didn't—" The first sound was not a gunshot. It was glass, somewhere on the facility's east wall, and then it was a gunshot, and then it was several more, rapid, from the east side of the building, and the night fractured into something entirely different from what it had been 30 seconds ago. Nathan moved first. He moved the way Charlotte had not seen him move before, not the controlled, deliberate stride of a man who owned every room he entered, but something faster and lower and entirely instinctive, his hand finding her arm before she'd fully processed the sounds, pulling her back through the facility door and to the left, away from the east wall where the glass had gone, putting his body between her and that direction without discussion or negotiation, the same way he'd thrown himself in front of her at the Moretti reception when the wine glass had shattered behind her and she'd flinched. Except this was not a wine glass and there was nothing performative about any of it. "Move," he said. One word. She moved. The interior of the warehouse was chaos assembling itself. Nathan's men were responding with the speed of a unit that trained for exactly this. Positions shifting, the industrial shelving becoming cover. The lights that had seemed merely functional now revealing the geometry of a space that needed to be navigated at speed and accurately. Marco was shouting coordinates in a shorthand Charlotte couldn't parse. Dino had appeared from somewhere with a weapon drawn. The 2 men from the war room were already at the east wall's secondary door. Nathan kept his hand on Charlotte's arm, not gripping, steering, the way you steer something you are responsible for without having time to explain why. "The office," he said to her, "back northwest corner, steel door, lock it from inside." She looked at him. 1 second. "Where are you?" "Charlotte." She went. The northwest corner office was exactly what he'd said. A foreman's office. Steel door, the kind of institutional lock that was built before aesthetics were a consideration. Charlotte got through it, pulled it shut, heard the lock engage, and stood in the dark for 3 seconds, letting her eyes adjust and her breathing slow to something functional. Then she assessed. There was a window, small, high on the wall, the industrial rectangle type that didn't open but let in the ambient light from the loading dock outside, enough that the room resolved into grays and darker grays. A desk, a filing cabinet, a landline phone on the desk that she went to immediately and picked up. Dial tone, still active, and then set down because she didn't know who she would call and what she would say, and the men outside were already handling this, and her calling 911 would complicate things in ways that had consequences beyond tonight. She stood at the desk with her hand on the phone and listened to the building. Gunfire in bursts, intervals between them. Voices. Some she recognized, some she didn't. The ones she didn't recognize speaking in a register that carried through walls with the specific quality of men who expected to be obeyed and were encountering the opposite. Metal on metal somewhere. Something heavy falling. Then a sustained stretch of nothing that was worse than the noise because it didn't tell her anything. Her heartbeat was steady. She noted this with something that was not quite surprise. She had expected something else. Panic, maybe? Or the specific kind of paralysis that arrived when your body decided the situation exceeded its capacity. But she was standing at a desk in the dark with her hand on a phone, and her heartbeat was measured, and her mind was running clean, running the same way it ran when she was managing something that required attention, cataloging, assessing, updating the model as information arrived. The east wall. 3 vehicles, secondary team. They didn't know. The question she kept returning to was, how didn't they know? Moreau in the chair, Moreau contained, and still a secondary team arrived with enough precision to hit the east access road and the window simultaneously. That kind of coordination required either very good real-time information about the facility's layout and Nathan's unit positions, or it required the secondary team to have been in position before the primary operation began. Already in position before Nathan's unit surrounded the facility. Charlotte's hand tightened on the phone. If the secondary team had been pre-positioned, Moreau hadn't come to Calumet expecting to be extracted by force. He'd come, or been brought, expecting the meeting to happen exactly as it had, expecting Nathan's response to the phone call to unfold in exactly the timeline it had unfolded, expecting to be in that chair under those lights at approximately that hour. Moreau hadn't walked into a trap. He'd built the trap and sat down in the center of it. Charlotte turned this over once, twice. Let it have the implications it had. If Nathan's approach had been anticipated, if Moreau had designed the entire thing from the phone call forward, then the operational information had to come from inside. Not from surveillance, not from an educated guess about Nathan's response protocols. From inside. 14 months, Nathan had said, of federal information leaking from the north side. Charlotte crossed to the door, put her ear against the steel, listened. The gunfire had stopped. Voices. Lower now, the register of aftermath rather than engagement. She waited. 30 seconds. A minute. Then footsteps and Nathan's voice on the other side of the door saying her name once, not loudly, with the particular inflection of someone checking rather than calling. She unlocked the door. He was standing in his corridor with a cut along his jaw that had bled down his neck and was still going, and his overcoat was gone. And there was something in his left hand she didn't look at. He looked at her with the flat, immediate attention that always assessed before it communicated. "You're all right," he said. Not a question. "You're bleeding," she said. "I know." "How bad is it out there?" "Managed." He looked at the cut on his own jaw the way he looked at most things, as information, not as something requiring an emotional response. 3 of Moreau's people down. 2 of mine injured, non-critical. Moreau is... He stopped. A very small pause. Moreau is gone. Charlotte felt the implications of that land. Gone. The back room. The door was sealed from our side. He was gone before the shooting started. She held his gaze. "He was never contained," she said. "He came here to be taken in. He sat in that chair and let us think we had him. And while we were moving him to the back room, his secondary team was already in position outside, and the back room had an exit he knew about, and we didn't." Nathan looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. "He used the facility," Charlotte said, "not a random staging point. He chose Calumet because he knew the layout, which means either he's used this facility before or someone told him about it." "Charlotte, someone in your operation," she said. "Someone who knew the Calumet facility was in your rotation, who knew your approach protocols, who knew that the back room had a secondary egress. Nathan, the federal leak and this, they're the same source." The corridor was very quiet. Nathan set down the thing in his left hand. She saw now it was a phone, not a weapon, and stood with his back against the corridor wall and looked at the floor for a moment in the way he looked at things when he was letting information settle into its final position. "Who knew about tonight?" Charlotte said. Not pushing, just following the logic to its end. "My core unit," Nathan said. 6 people. Marco, Dino, Sal, Benedetto. She'd named 4. "Who are the other 2? He looked at her. His jaw was still bleeding. She had the specific domestic impulse to do something about that and overrode it. Because this was not the moment. "A man named Reyes," Nathan said slowly. "He's been with me 12 years, senior operational. He handled the secondary positioning for tonight, the east side diversion that was supposed to pull Moreau's attention." "The diversion that didn't work," Charlotte said. "The diversion that didn't engage." Their eyes held. "And the 6th, Charlotte said. Nathan's jaw tightened. The blood moved down his neck. "His name is Paul Garrett," Nathan said. "He manages communications. Every operational call tonight went through him." Charlotte said nothing. She waited. "Garrett has been with me for 9 years," Nathan said. "He was Elena's cousin." The sentence landed in the corridor and sat there. Charlotte took one breath. Did he know what Moreau did to Elena? He was at the funeral. Nathan's voice was entirely without affect now. That specific flatness that wasn't absence of feeling, but the result of feeling being processed into something that couldn't be touched by external pressure. He wept. "Then he's been planning this for 9 years," Charlotte said quietly. "Or Moreau got to him after. Offered him something. Either way." She stopped. Where is Garrett now? He should be at the communications post, west side of the facility. Should be. Nathan looked at her once more. The full, flat, total attention. And then he moved down the corridor without another word. And Charlotte followed him because standing in a locked office while something this important resolved itself was not something she was capable of doing. The West Side Communications Post was a converted storage room. 3 monitors, a radio unit, the portable infrastructure of a field operation. The door was open. Inside, the monitors were still running. The radio was active and transmitting nothing, and the camp chair in front of the equipment was empty. On the floor beside the chair was a phone, cracked screen, still lit. Nathan crouched and looked at it without picking it up. Charlotte stood in the doorway. "He ran," she said. "He ran." Nathan stood. His face had settled into something Charlotte had never seen before, and hoped she was reading incorrectly because what she read in it was the specific look of a man who has been betrayed by someone he trusted enough to grieve in front of. Marco appeared in the corridor behind Charlotte. He took in the empty room and the chair, and his face went through several things in rapid succession that he then controlled. "Garrett," Nathan said. Not a question. Marco's jaw worked. "The exterior cameras on the west side went dark 20 minutes ago. I thought it was the firefight interfering with the signal." "It was Garrett interfering with the signal." A silence. 12 years, Marco said. It came out low. Not quite an accusation, and not quite grief. The place between those two things. "Get everyone mobile," Nathan said. "Moreau has a head start, and Garrett has our communications pattern. We need to assume everything transmitted tonight is compromised." He looked at Marco with a steadiness that cost him something. Charlotte could see the cost of it, the specific effort of a man holding a structure together from the inside while something in it had just given way. "And get someone to look at this." He touched the side of his jaw briefly. Marco nodded and moved. Nathan turned to Charlotte. He looked at her in the doorway of the communications room for a moment, and she thought he was going to say something about going back to the estate, about taking the armored car, about the operational necessity of removing her from the area. She was already composing the response in her head, the clean, direct explanation of why she was not going anywhere until she understood what was happening and what came next. He said, "You figured out the source before I did." Charlotte absorbed this. It was not what she'd been preparing for. "I had distance," she said. "I wasn't managing the operation. I was in a locked room with nothing to do but think. That's not why." He looked at her. The totality of it, the gray eyes that missed nothing. "You see structures, the way things connect, the way pressure moves through systems." He paused. "I've been doing this for 15 years and I missed it. You've been doing it for 45 minutes. She didn't know what to do with that. She looked at the empty chair in the communications room and thought about Paul Garrett sitting in it all night, managing the transmissions, routing the operational data to a man who had killed the person he claimed to have grieved. "Where does Moreau go?" she said. "If he's running, tonight." "He has safe locations," Nathan said. 4 of them in the metro area that I know of. Garrett knows all 4. "Then Garrett will take him somewhere you don't know." "Yes." "Which means you need someone to tell you where that is." Charlotte thought. "Moreau's people inside. The 3 who are down and the ones your team detained. Any of them operational enough to know his contingency locations?" "Possibly one. A man named Trace. He's been Moreau's logistics coordinator for 7 years." "Then Trace is your next conversation," Charlotte said, "and you need to have it before Garrett can get a message to him." Nathan was already moving. He stopped once, 3 steps down the corridor, and looked back at her. "Stay with Dino," he said. "Not because I'm managing you, because Dino is the best shot in this building, and until tonight resolves, you're the most effective leverage against me that exists." Charlotte heard that sentence in its entirety, all of what it contained. "Okay," she said. Dino materialized from somewhere down the corridor with the reliability of someone who had been told to be where he needed to be before he was told. Charlotte fell into step with him, and they moved through the facility toward the main floor, and Charlotte was aware of the building around her. The smell of it, cordite and cold concrete, and the wet January air coming through the damaged east wall, the industrial lights that hummed at a frequency you only heard when everything else went quiet. The conversation with Trace happened in the main floor foreman's station, visible through the glass partition from where Charlotte stood with Dino near the far wall. She watched it without being able to hear it. Nathan. The man called Trace, who was sitting with the particular posture of someone who was physically restrained but was processing something more complex than captivity. Calculation. She could read it from 20 feet away. The look of a man deciding what his information was worth and to whom. It lasted 11 minutes. When Nathan came out of the foreman's station, his face was doing the thing it did when information had arrived and been integrated and was now producing decisions. A property in Pullman, he said to Marco, under a name that's not in our database. Garrett would know it from Moreau's contingency files. He looked at the group assembled. 6 men, Charlotte, the specific geometry of what was left after a night like this one. We move in 40 minutes. Clean approach. No advanced communication through any channel Garrett has touched. Everything goes through Marco from this point. He looked at Charlotte last. She met his eyes and said nothing because there was nothing to say that the situation hadn't already said. You stay mobile, he said. Armored car, outside the perimeter. Marco's direct line in your hand the entire time. If the perimeter moves, Dino moves you. And if something happens to you, Charlotte said. The words came out steadier than she expected. She hadn't planned them. They arrived complete. The question that was underneath everything else she'd been managing for the past 3 hours. The thing she'd been keeping in its compartment and that had now declined to stay there. Nathan looked at her. Then you go to the estate, he said. There's a document in the safe in my study. Left side, behind the Sandberg collection. The combination is the date of our ceremony. Everything you need to make decisions for the Callaway interests is in that document. You would have full authority. Charlotte stared at him. That's not what I was asking. His jaw was still bleeding, slower now, drying at the edge. He looked tired in a way she'd never seen on him before. Not diminished, just the kind of tired that comes from a very long time of holding things together through will alone. I know, he said quietly. The 40 minutes of preparation moved at the speed of things that matter. Fast in retrospect, interminable in the living of them. Charlotte sat in the armored car outside the facility with Dino in the driver's seat and her phone in her hand showing Marco's number and the January drizzle on the windshield and the sound of the city being itself at midnight on a Thursday. She thought about the note Nathan had written her before the ceremony. You are not a debt. You are not a bargain. She thought about what she had walked into believing and what she now understood. She thought about the difference between being protected and being regarded, and how she had spent her entire life receiving neither, and had somehow arrived in a situation where she was receiving both from the most feared man in Chicago, and how the most feared man in Chicago had a cut on his jaw, and 9 years of betrayal he hadn't known about, and was moving toward a property in Pullman in the middle of the night because someone had used her father and her name and the machinery of his grief to try to dismantle everything he'd built. Dino said nothing. He was good at nothing. Charlotte appreciated it the same way she appreciated Vera's brisk practicality. The people who understood that presence didn't require noise. Her phone lit up. Marco. She answered. We're at the Pullman property, Marco said. His voice was compressed, controlled. The version of his voice that didn't have room for anything extraneous. Moreau is here. Garrett is here. We have the perimeter. A pause that lasted 2 seconds and felt longer. Garrett has a phone. He's been transmitting since they arrived. We don't know who to yet. Charlotte's hand tightened on the phone. Does Nathan know? Nathan knows. What's he doing? Marco stopped. In the background, something. A door. A voice that she recognized, even compressed by the phone's speaker and the distance of a Pullman street at midnight. Then Marco. Charlotte. Nathan's going in. She heard the call end. She sat with the dead phone in her hand and the rain on the windshield and Dino very still in the driver's seat, and then she said, Dino. Yeah. How far are we from the Pullman property? A pause. 7 minutes. Maybe 6. She looked at the phone, looked at the windshield, looked at the city beyond it, indifferent and enormous, going about the business of its midnight self. Then drive, she said. Dino looked at her in the rearview mirror. 1 second, he was running the calculation. What Nathan had told him, what Charlotte was telling him, the specific weight of a direct instruction from the woman who was, whatever the complexity of the circumstances, Mrs. Charlotte Callaway. He drove. The Pullman property was a row house on a street that had seen better economic decades. Maintained but barely, The kind of neighborhood that existed in the specific Chicago way of being historically significant and currently invisible. 3 of Nathan's vehicles were at the perimeter. Men Charlotte recognized from the facility were positioned with the organized stillness of a unit in active containment. She was out of the armored car before Dino had fully stopped it, which she understood was not what Nathan had arranged, and also understood was not something she was capable of managing differently. Marco met her at the perimeter line. His face said several things simultaneously. "Where is he?" Charlotte said. "Inside, second floor. Moreau and Garrett are—" Marco stopped. From the second floor of the row house, through a window that was lit and uncurtained, 2 voices. One of them Nathan's, one of them pitched with the specific register of a man who has decided desperation is his last available position. "Garrett. He's trying to negotiate," Marco said. "He has information. The federal contacts, the North Side source, everything he's fed them for the past 14 months. He's offering it in exchange for—" Marco's voice tightened. "In exchange for Moreau's safety. He's protecting Moreau." Charlotte stared at him. "After what Moreau did to Elena." "That's what Nathan is trying to understand," Marco said. She looked up at the lit window. The voice that was Garrett's rose, cracked, found something that sounded less like negotiation and more like confession. Raw, pressured, the sound of a man who had been carrying something for a very long time in a very tight space and had run out of room. Charlotte moved toward the door. Marco put a hand out, not grabbing, offering resistance. "Charlotte, I'm not going to do anything," she said. "I just need Nathan to know I'm here." Marco looked at her. Then he stepped aside. She went through the door and up the stairs and stopped in the doorway of the second-floor room where Nathan stood 6 feet from Paul Garrett and where Vincent Moreau sat against the far wall with the expression of a man watching a chess match he'd set up, and where the air had the specific quality of a conversation that had passed through several layers and arrived at something irreversible. Garrett looked at Charlotte when she appeared in the doorway. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-40s, dark-haired, with a face that would have been unremarkable anywhere except that it was currently doing the work of a man coming apart at the joints. His eyes were red. His hands were shaking. "He told me," Garrett said, to Nathan, still looking at Charlotte. "Moreau told me 3 years ago he came to me. He said Elena's accident wasn't an accident. I knew that. I always suspected." His voice broke and repaired itself badly. "He said if I helped him, he'd give me the name of the person who actually ordered it." The room was very still. "He said it wasn't him," Garrett said. "He said Elena's death was ordered by someone inside the Calloway organization, someone Nathan trusted. And he said if I worked with him long enough, he'd give me the proof." Nathan's face was stone. "And did he?" Nathan said. One sentence, completely level. Garrett's mouth worked. "Did he give you the name, Paul?" Something in Garrett's face collapsed. "No," he whispered. "He kept saying, 'Next month. Another piece of information, another operation, and then he'd have what I needed. For 3 years. For 3 years He stopped, looked at Moreau. And the look he gave Vincent Moreau was the specific look of a man arriving, in real time, at the conclusion he should have reached much earlier, and had not, because grief had made him available to be used. Moreau, against the far wall, met that look with a calm that was absolute and entirely without apology. "He was never going to give me the name," Garrett said. His voice had gone quiet. "There is no name. There's no proof. There's nothing." He looked at Nathan. "He made it up. He needed someone inside, and I was available, because I was angry, and I loved her, and The sentence didn't finish. Nathan stood in the center of the room, and the silence that came out of him was different from all the other silences Charlotte had learned to read over the past months. She looked at him from the doorway. He was looking at Paul Garrett, and what was in his face was not the cold rage she'd expected, and not the controlled blankness he used for operational decisions, and not the measuring attention he brought to rooms he was assessing. What was in his face was something older and more human than any of those, something that had been under all of them the entire time, and it was grief, plain and unmanaged. The grief of a man who had lost his wife and now stood in front of the person who'd been manipulated by that loss into doing damage that couldn't be fully calculated, and who understood, Charlotte could see him understand it, that Garrett had not been an enemy. He had been another victim. Nathan turned. He looked at Charlotte in the doorway, and in the particular way he looked at her, not as an assessment, not with the careful, measured attention of a man managing his world, but with the simple, unguarded directness of someone who needed to see that a specific person was still standing, Charlotte understood something she had been managing not to understand for several weeks. She stepped fully into the room. Behind her on the stairs, she could hear Marco's footsteps and Dino's and the organized movement of a unit completing its containment, and the city outside doing its midnight thing, and Garrett somewhere behind her beginning to make the sounds of a man who has finished holding himself together. Vincent Moreau, against the far wall, watched all of it with the expression of a man recalculating his position and finding the numbers worse than he'd designed them to be. He looked from Nathan to Charlotte. He looked at Charlotte the way he'd looked at her in the warehouse, with the assessing attention of someone who had categorized her as peripheral and was now revising that categorization in real time. She saw the moment he understood that she had come here on her own, that she had not stayed in the armored car, that she was standing in this room because she had chosen to stand in this room, and that the choice said something about the geometry of Nathan Calloway's world that changed Moreau's calculation in ways he hadn't prepared for. "Mrs. Calloway," Moreau said. It was the first time he had addressed her directly. His voice was the voice of a man who was making one final play with whatever pieces remained to him, and Charlotte looked at him across the room, and her heartbeat was steady, and her hands were at her sides, and she was standing exactly where she had chosen to stand. "Mr. Moreau?" she said, and before he could deploy whatever he'd prepared, before the final play could be made, Nathan said her name. Not loudly, just once, the way he said everything. And she looked at him, and what passed between them in that look was not a warning, and not an instruction, and not the careful protocol of two people managing an arrangement. It was something they had both been building toward since a November night in a freight office, and it had arrived here, in a Pullman row house at midnight, in the worst possible circumstances, and with the worst possible audience, and it was nevertheless entirely real. The door behind Moreau moved, a sound, not from Nathan's men, the wrong direction, the wrong quality, and Charlotte had approximately 1 second to register that Moreau's face had changed from calculation to something that looked almost like relief before the room. The door behind Moreau came off its frame, not dramatically. Not the way doors came off frames in the kind of stories where everything was designed for maximum effect. It came off the way structural failures happen in real buildings under real force. A single compressed sound, wood giving at the hinges, and then the door was no longer a door, but an obstacle on the floor. And two men came through the opening with the low, purposeful movement of people who had been waiting outside that door for exactly the right moment. They were not Nathan's men. Charlotte registered this in the same instant she registered Nathan's movement, the way he turned from her and dropped into a crouch simultaneously, the instinct of a body that had trained for exactly this convergence of variables. The first of the two men raised something, and Nathan was already moving laterally, not toward Charlotte, but toward the threat. The calculation of a man who understood that the most efficient protection was the elimination of the threat rather than the positioning of a body between it and a person he cared about. The sound that followed was close enough to be physical. Charlotte's ears rang. She was against the wall without knowing how she'd gotten there. The wall at her left shoulder, her back against the plaster, the door frame she'd been standing in now behind her. The room had reorganized itself in approximately 2 seconds. Dino was through the second door, the one Charlotte had come through, with his weapon out and his voice producing something sharp and specific that was not a word but functioned as one. Marco behind him. Nathan had his hand on the first man's arm and was doing something with it that was efficient and horrible, and produced a sound Charlotte classified and set aside because there was no useful response to it in this moment. The second man looked at Charlotte. He looked at her the way Moreau had told him to look at her, with the specific attention of someone who had been given a purpose in this room that was not combat. He took 2 steps toward her. Charlotte picked up the chair. It was a folding chair, metal, the cheap institutional kind that weighted almost nothing, and she swung it not with strength, but with the accuracy of someone who has identified the correct target. The side of his knee, lateral, because she had been standing in enough of these rooms in the past 6 hours to understand that bringing someone down was about geometry, not force. The man's knee buckled. He went sideways. He did not go down completely, but he went sideways, and that was enough. Dino covered the distance from the door in 3 steps, and the situation resolved itself in the specific way situations resolved when a trained professional arrived at a manageable problem. The room went quiet. Charlotte was still holding the chair. She set it down. Her hands were shaking now. She noted this without judgment, understood it as the body doing its accounting after the fact, the nervous system catching up with what the brain had already processed and acted on. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed. Nathan was across the room. He was upright. He looked at her, the immediate, total look, and she gave him a single nod that said what the nod needed to say, which was functional, intact, no assistance required. Vincent Moreau had not moved from the wall. He was watching the room settle with an expression that Charlotte could now read clearly because she had been reading him all night and the grammar of his face had become familiar. He had planned for the 2 men at the back door. He had planned for the moment of chaos that followed them. He had planned for a specific outcome in this room, and the outcome was not materializing because the chair had connected with a knee, and Dino moved at the speed he moved, and Charlotte Calloway was still standing upright and uncooperative. Moreau looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at Moreau. The quality of that silence was different from all the silences that had preceded it. It was the silence of 2 men who had been in opposition for years and had arrived at the room where it ended, and both of them knew it, and neither of them was interested in anything that wasn't the truth of it. "It's done, Vincent," Nathan said. Moreau's jaw moved. Once. He looked at the 2 men on the floor, one incapacitated, one in Dino's custody, and the chair sitting at an angle where Charlotte had set it, and Paul Garrett against the far wall who had ceased to be a variable and become simply a man who was exhausted and done. And he looked at all of this with the expression of a strategist watching a board game reach its final configuration and understanding that the configuration was not in his favor. "You think this is done?" Moreau said. His voice was the same, composed even, the voice of a man who had maintained his register through 30 years of situations that would have undone most people. "You take me in, Nathan. Federal contacts, Garrett's information, whatever you've assembled. You think that ends it?" "No," Nathan said. "I think it begins a specific process that ends it. Your organization has been feeding information to a DOJ task force for 14 months through 3 separate handlers. I have the meeting transcripts, the handler names, and the specific operational data that was passed." Nathan looked at him with the absolute steadiness that was his most dangerous quality. Not aggression, not heat, but the specific gravity of a man who had already done the work. "Your senior people made a decision about the future of Moreau operations, Vincent. They made it without you." Something moved in Moreau's face. The first genuine thing Charlotte had seen there all night. It wasn't fear. Moreau was not constructed for fear in any ordinary sense. It was the specific, gutting recognition of a man who understood in one clean moment that the war he'd been fighting had already been decided behind him. "The summit," Moreau said. "Canceled," Nathan said. "I made 3 calls an hour ago. The families have been briefed on the federal situation. Nobody is attending anything with Moreau exposure until the landscape settles, which means your leverage at the summit is gone, which means the operational cover the summit was providing for your East Side restructuring is gone." He paused. "You have nothing left to trade with, Vincent, except the truth about Elena." The room breathed. Charlotte stayed very still against the wall. Moreau looked at Nathan for a long moment. The calculation in his face was doing something she hadn't seen it do all night. Winding down. The way a machine wound down when the power was removed, not collapsing, not breaking, just arriving at the end of what it could do. "The Gaines family," Moreau said finally. "Your father's original partners. Before Marcus Calloway built the syndicate out from under them and left them with 2 operations and a name that meant nothing. The pros Mafiaboss," he said it flatly. "Reporting. They came to me 6 years ago. They wanted the Calloway syndicate destabilized. They offered resources. The Elena Calloway situation was..." He stopped. The word he bypassed was operational. Charlotte could see him bypass it. "It was their initiative. I provided the mechanism." Nathan's breath didn't change. Nothing in his body changed. The only evidence of what the sentence cost him was in his hands, the way they stayed completely open at his sides, completely controlled, because the alternative to that control was something he wouldn't allow in a room with Garrett still present. The Gaines family, Nathan said. Harlan Gaines is 69 years old and lives in a residential hotel in Phoenix, Moreau said. His son Derek runs what remains of the operation out of a logistics company in Naperville. They paid me $400,000 and I arranged the vehicle failure. He met Nathan's eyes. I'm telling you this because you'll find it anyway. And the version where I tell you is the version where I have some small remaining utility to you. Garrett made a sound from the far wall. It was not a word. It was the sound of a man hearing a confirmation he had been manipulated for 3 years into not believing, arriving in real time, without cushioning. Nathan looked at Garrett. Something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not anything that clean or that fast, but the acknowledgement of two men who had both been used by the same machinery and who were now, for the first time, on the same side of the information. We'll talk, Nathan said to Garrett. Just that. Garrett nodded. His face was wrecked in the specific way of someone who has paid a very high price for a very long time and has arrived at the other side of it with less than they started with and more than they deserve, given the accounting. Marco came fully into the room. He looked at the scene, the two men down, Moreau against the wall, the chair at its angle, Charlotte still positioned near the doorframe. With the practiced efficiency of a man doing damage assessment. Federal contact, Nathan said to him. Tonight. Not morning. It's 12:43, Marco said. Tonight, Nathan said again. Marco pulled out his phone and walked to the corridor. Nathan crossed the room to Charlotte. He stopped in front of her. Close. Closer than the careful, measured distance he'd maintained for months, the considerate distance of a man who understood that space was a form of respect and had given it consistently. He stood close enough that she could see the dried blood on his jaw and the exhaustion under his eyes, and the specific quality of what was in his face, which was not the controlled measurement she'd learned to read, but something entirely unmanaged. Your hands, he said. She looked down. They were still shaking slightly. Adrenaline, she said. I know. He reached out and covered both her hands with one of his, just held them. The warmth of it was so simple and so unexpected. Not a gesture, not a statement, just the physical fact of a warm hand over shaking one's, that Charlotte's breath caught in a way she hadn't been able to catch it on anything in this entire night. She looked up at him. I told you to stay in the car, he said. You told Dino to drive me, she said. I told Dino to drive here. Something moved in his expression. The chair, he said. It was available. He looked at her for a moment that lasted longer than most moments in this room had lasted, and then he said, You're extraordinary. I need you to know that I know that. Charlotte held his gaze. Her hands had stopped shaking under his. I know, she said. And then, because the night had been long and she was tired and the truth was simpler than everything they'd built around it. So are you, in ways I didn't expect and probably should have. Neither of them said anything else in that room. There wasn't anything else that needed to be said in that room. The next 4 hours were the administrative hours. The federal contact arrived at the Pullman property at 2:15. A woman named Hargrove, mid-50s, with the compressed professional manner of someone who had been woken from sleep and was not resentful about it because she understood the information she was receiving was worth the hour. She sat with Nathan and Marco in the row house's front room for 90 minutes, while Charlotte sat in the kitchen with Dino and a coffee she'd made from the limited provisions in the house's cabinets, and listened to the building settle around her. Moreau was taken into federal custody at 3:41. Charlotte watched it happen from the front window. The specific, undramatic process of a man in handcuffs being walked to a dark vehicle on a Pullman street in the January dark, surrounded by professionals who treated it as the procedural conclusion it was. No drama. No final statement. Moreau did not look back at the row house. Paul Garrett gave his statement to Hargrove's people and was taken to a location that Marco described as protective, and Charlotte understood as the beginning of a very long and complicated legal process that would determine what remained of Garrett's life after a 9-year detour. Marco said nothing about Garrett beyond the factual. Charlotte said nothing either. She thought about Elena Calloway, the woman she'd never met who had lived in the suite across from hers, presumably at some point when it was not a guest suite but a primary bedroom, and who had been a piece in someone else's game and had paid the ultimate price for it. She thought about what Nathan had said at the kitchen table in the gray January morning that seemed several months ago now. She died, and neither of those facts changed regardless of what I did afterward. She thought about the note in her clutch. Still there. She'd carried it every day. At 5 in the morning, the Callaway vehicles pulled away from Pullman and moved north through the emptied pre-dawn streets of Chicago. Charlotte sat in the back of the armored car with Nathan. He had a field dressing on his jaw now. Dino had produced a kit with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone for whom field dressings were a standard equipment item, and he looked like a man who had been awake for 20 hours managing things that needed managing and had reached the far shore of it. He was looking out the window. Charlotte was looking at the city. "Harlan Gaines," she said. "I know. That's not over." "No." She nodded. "Let it be what it was. But tonight is over. Tonight is over," he said. The city moved past the windows. The lake was out there somewhere in the east dark, doing whatever the lake did at 5 in the morning in January, which was probably the same thing it did at every other hour. Its own vast, indifferent thing, enormously unconcerned with the human machinery playing out on its shore. Charlotte had always found that comforting. The scale of indifference at a certain size became oddly sustaining. She became aware that Nathan was no longer looking out his window. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the unguarded quality she'd first seen in the Pullman row house, the thing underneath the control, the thing that the control had been built to protect for a long time, now present in the gray pre-dawn light of the back seat, without apology or management. "I want to tell you something," he said. Charlotte waited. "When your father made the offer that night," Nathan said, "I had come to that freight office to take the building. I had no intention of... There was no version of that meeting I'd planned that didn't end with Gerald Hayes losing his company and his equipment and starting over from nothing." He paused. "And then you were standing in the doorway with a container of soup, and you looked at me and you said he doesn't get to make that offer with the same tone you'd use to correct a factual error. And I..." He stopped, looked at the window, looked back. "I changed my mind about what I wanted from that room." Charlotte held the sentence. "Why?" she said. "Because in 15 years of doing what I do," Nathan said, "I had not seen anyone stand in that position and be that clear. That's not courage, or it's not only courage. It's something else. It's knowing what you are when everything around you is telling you that you're something less." He looked at her. "You knew. Standing there with soup in that office, in that moment, you knew what you were." Charlotte's throat did something she managed. "I didn't feel like I knew," she said. "I felt terrified." "I know. You did it anyway." She looked at him for a moment. At the dressing on his jaw and the exhaustion in the gray eyes that missed nothing and had, for several months, been looking at her with an attention she'd been carefully not fully receiving, because fully receiving it required her to give up the last of the distance she'd been keeping for her own protection. She let the distance go. It didn't feel like falling. It felt like setting something down that had gotten heavier than she'd realized from carrying it so long. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Not as a declaration, just as a fact, offered in the same tone she used for facts. "I want you to know that. Whatever comes next with Gaines, whatever the legal process looks like, whatever the summit situation becomes, I'm not a guest in that house. I haven't been for a while." Nathan looked at her. "No," he said quietly. "You haven't." They arrived at the estate at 5:40 in the morning. The sky was doing the thing Chicago skies did in January just before light. Not dark, not light. A specific, indeterminate gray that was its own kind of color. The grounds were wet and bare, and the house stood in the middle of them the way it always stood, with the particular solidity of a thing built to outlast what moved around it. Vera was in the kitchen when they came in. She looked at Nathan's jaw and said, "Sit down." And he sat, which Charlotte noted as data because she had never seen Nathan sit when told to sit by anyone. Vera cleaned the wound with the brisk competence of a woman who had done this before and had opinions about field dressings that she chose not to voice. Charlotte put the kettle on because something needed to be done with her hands, and tea was the thing she knew how to produce in quantity and without thought. Marco came in behind them. Then Dino. Then Sal, who said nothing but ate 3 of the leftover cinnamon rolls from the day before, with the focused devotion of a man whose body had made demands he was only now addressing. The kitchen filled up the way it had been filling up for months. Incrementally, without announcement, bodies arranging themselves around the warmth and the smell of something being made. Charlotte made tea. She made eggs because there were eggs, and a kitchen this size had no excuse for people going without protein after a night like this one. She moved through the space the way she moved through it every morning, which was to say, without asking permission, without explaining herself, knowing where everything was because she had learned it and made it hers. Vera watched her for a moment from her position at the first aid kit. "You're bleeding," Vera said. To Charlotte, entirely matter of fact. Charlotte looked down. Her forearm, inside the sleeve of her coat. She'd pushed the sleeve up to cook, and there it was. A cut she hadn't felt receive, shallow but long, from the metal edge of the folding chair, or the room, or something in the 2 seconds of chaos she hadn't fully cataloged. She looked at it the way she looked at most things. Assessed, filed, addressed. "After the eggs," she said. Vera made a sound that was not agreement and not disagreement, but was very distinctly Vera. Nathan, from the kitchen table, was watching her. She didn't look at him. She cracked eggs. The morning came in the way January mornings came in Chicago. Reluctantly, the light arriving in degrees rather than all at once. The sky moving from gray to a pale, watery brightness that illuminated the grounds and the bare trees and the lake in the far distance without warming anything. Charlotte stood at the kitchen window with her tea and her bandaged arm and looked at all of it while the kitchen behind her held the sounds of people eating and coffee being poured and Marco's voice, low, on a phone call that she understood from the tone was the first of many that would happen today. The work of aftermath. The legal process beginning its slow institutional motion. The federal contact, Hargrove, would be building her case from what Nathan had given her. Moreau in custody, the 14 months of task force information Garrett had provided, now contextualized within the larger picture of what the Gaines family had set in motion 6 years ago. Harlan Gaines and his son Derek would receive visits they had not planned for. The logistics company in Naperville would become a subject of interest in ways that would take months to fully resolve. None of it would be fast. None of it would be clean. Charlotte understood this the way she understood most complex things, not with the expectation of a different reality, but with the practical acceptance of the one that existed. She heard Nathan push his chair back from the table. She heard him come to stand beside her at the window. They stood for a moment looking at the grounds, the wet January grounds, the bare trees, the pale light making everything look new and slightly unconvincing, the way things did at the beginning of a day that had required the night it followed. "Gerald," Charlotte said. "Yes. He'll need to leave Chicago." She said it without heat. "Whatever arrangement makes that happen, that's what I want. Not punishment, just distance." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Done." "I'm not forgiving him," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I understand what he did, and I'm not... It's not that. I just don't want to spend energy being angry at a man who is simply exactly what he is." She paused. "Some people are exactly what they are, and knowing it is enough. You don't have to do more with it than that." "No," Nathan agreed. "You don't." Charlotte drank her tea. The grounds were starting to show some detail as the light improved. The hedgerows she'd walked along in the months she'd been here. The kitchen garden she'd looked at from this window and thought about spring, the wide space of it that had felt enormous when she'd first arrived, and now felt like something she'd learned the dimensions of. "Elena," she said. Nathan was still beside her. He didn't move. "The Gaines family," Charlotte said. "That needs to go through the legal process. Through Hargrove and what she builds. Not through..." She stopped, chose the words. "Not through anything that creates more exposure for you than you already have. Not through anything that makes what Elena was worth the same as what they made her." A long pause. "You're right," Nathan said. "I know." She looked at him. He was looking at the grounds. His profile was the same as it always was. Cut, precise, giving very little, but she knew it well enough now to read what it was giving, and what it gave was the specific quality of a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and was being told, by someone he trusted, that he was allowed to set it down. "She would have liked you," Nathan said. He said it quietly, without sentimentality, just the flat, clean delivery of something he'd thought and decided was true and worth saying. Charlotte held that for a moment. "Tell me about her sometime," she said, "when it's not tonight." "All right." The kitchen behind them had settled into its morning register, quieter now, the acute exhaustion of the night finding its level in the people who'd been carrying it. Dino had fallen asleep at the table, his head on his arms, and nobody had moved him. Sal was on his second coffee and his fifth silence. Marco had finished his call and was writing things in a notebook with the systematic focus of a man who processed by writing it down. Vera appeared at Charlotte's elbow and redressed the arm with a second bandage that was applied with considerably more care than the field version, and said nothing about it, and went back to the kettle. Charlotte looked at her arm, looked at the window. She thought about the November night, the rain and the parking lot, and the soup container warm in her hands and the word "okay" coming out of her mouth in the smallest register she'd ever used for a decision that large. She thought about the note. "You are not a debt. You are not a bargain." She had known, reading it, that it was a true thing. She had not known then the full size of what was true about it. 6 months ago, she had been a woman who brought her father soup and worked a bakery counter and believed, in some unexamined foundational way, that the world had a consensus about what she was worth, and that consensus was not high. She had built a life inside that consensus with the efficient sadness of someone who has accepted a verdict they didn't agree with because the alternative was an argument they didn't have the resources for. She was not that woman now, not because anyone had fixed her, not because Nathan Calloway had protected her in a ballroom and written her a note and treated her like a person whose opinions about her own life were worth consulting. Those things had happened and they had mattered, but they were not what had changed her. What had changed her was something she'd done herself. Standing in a freight office in the rain and saying he doesn't get to make that offer, and walking into a war room and sitting down without being asked, and picking up a chair in a Pullman row house at midnight because the geometry was correct, and she was the person who was there. She had discovered what she was made of. The discovery was not comfortable. It was not warm. It was the specific, bracing knowledge of someone who has looked at themselves under operational pressure and found that what was there was real. It was enough. Nathan said her name. She turned. He was looking at her with the unguarded thing again, open in a way she understood now was not easy for him, was in fact the most effortful thing he did, the management of a man who had built entire systems of control because the alternative was exposure, and who was choosing, in this kitchen in the early light, to let those systems down. "Come here," he said. She crossed the kitchen to him. He put his arms around her, not dramatically, not like a scene, but the way you held on to something you were afraid of losing, and had come close enough to losing that the fear was still present in the grip. She felt his breath against her hair and the warmth of him and the slight tension in his jaw from the wound, and all the human fact of it, and she let herself be held the way she had not let herself be held by anything or anyone for as long as she could remember. She pressed her palm flat against his chest. His heartbeat was there. Steady. Hers, she realized, was steady too. Across the kitchen, Marco looked up from his notebook, looked at them, looked back at his notebook with the expression of a man who had waited 11 years for a specific thing to happen and was now electing to be very interested in his handwriting. Dino slept on. Outside the window, the January light finished arriving. It was the pale, uninflected light of a winter morning in a city that was very old at doing what cities did, containing human lives in their full complexity and continuing regardless, indifferent, and vast, and somehow, in the aggregate, sustaining. The grounds held their bare shapes. The trees stood in the particular dignified patience of things waiting for spring. In the weeks that followed, the architecture of the Calloway Syndicate changed. It changed the way complex things changed when the conditions that shaped them shifted. Not all at once, not in a single declared moment, but in the accumulated weight of decisions made differently. Nathan moved the federal cooperation forward through channels Hargrove had established, providing information about the Gaines family's involvement in Elena's death through legal mechanisms that Hargrove built into a case that was thorough and would be slow and would be, in the end, definitive. Derek Gaines was arrested in Naperville on a March morning that Charlotte read about in the newspaper with her coffee and her bread and said nothing about, which was its own statement. Harlan Gaines, 69 years old, in a Phoenix residential hotel, received a visit from federal agents on the same day and declined to comment on anything, which also said what it said. Moreau's organization did not survive the implosion of its senior leadership's cooperation with the DOJ task force. It dispersed into its component parts, and the component parts were absorbed by adjacent operations and by the slow institutional processes of federal prosecution. And by spring, what had been Vincent Moreau's Chicago presence was primarily a series of case numbers in a federal building on Dearborn Street. Paul Garrett spent 8 months in a federal cooperation program, providing information that was comprehensive and detailed and that demonstrated, when laid out in full, both the extent of the damage he had done and the specific human tragedy of how he'd been positioned to do it. Nathan met with him once, in April, in a room that Charlotte did not enter, and whose contents Nathan did not fully describe. He came home from that meeting quieter than usual, ate his dinner, drank his coffee, and sat in the library for an hour with a book he did not read. Charlotte brought him a piece of bread she'd made that afternoon. The dark, seeded kind, the kind that required the most physical engagement, and set it on the table beside him and went back to the kitchen without comment. When she came to the library doorway an hour later to turn off the light, the bread was gone and Nathan was asleep in the chair. She turned off the light and went upstairs. Gerald Hayes left Chicago in February. Nathan arranged it with the precise, minimal efficiency he brought to things he'd decided to handle cleanly. Gerald went to a smaller city, not named, not discussed, with enough resources to begin something and no connection to anything in Chicago that could be used against anyone. Charlotte received a letter from him in March. She opened it. She read it. She did not respond. She put it in the desk drawer in her suite and closed the drawer and went back to the kitchen and made bread. And the bread was very good, and she gave most of it to Marco, who ate it with the uncomplicated gratitude of a man who had learned not to waste good things. She did not forgive Gerald Hayes. She did not require forgiving him. She had set that down in a Calumet warehouse in January, and she had found, setting it down, that the weight she'd been carrying wasn't anger, but something older. The exhausted hope of a child who had believed, in spite of all available evidence, that a parent would eventually become what they were supposed to be. Releasing the hope was not the same as releasing love. She had loved Gerald Hayes in the way you love the idea of a father, and she understood now that the idea and the man were separate things, and that she could let the man go without losing the idea, which lived in her mother's memory and in her own early childhood and belonged to her regardless of what Gerald Hayes chose to do with the time he had left. She was 25 in March. Nathan asked her what she wanted for her birthday. She said, "The kitchen garden." She'd been looking at it since November. He looked at her. "It's winter." "I know. I want to plan it now so it's ready when it isn't." He arranged for a landscape consultation the following week, and Charlotte spent 4 hours with the consultant going over soil composition and drainage and which vegetables would grow in the specific light conditions of the east garden face. And Nathan sat at the kitchen table through all of it with his coffee and his reports, and did not once suggest she was being excessive about root vegetable spacing. This was also a form of love Charlotte had come to understand. Not the dramatic form, the form that showed up in the quality of attention, in the consistency of space given, in the specific patience of a man who had spent 15 years moving through his world with no one beside him and was learning, at 38, what it meant to have someone beside him in the permanent sense. She was learning it too. Not from scratch. She had known what she was made of, discovered that in January, did not need to learn it again. But the other thing, the thing of being two people who had chosen each other in a freight office in November for reasons that were partly practical and had become, in the living of them, entirely something else. That she was learning in increments, the way you learned anything real, imperfectly, with setbacks, with the occasional morning where the distances between two people felt wide, for reasons neither of them could immediately articulate, and with the far more frequent experience of the distance being simply absent, the way it was absent now. On a Tuesday evening in late April, Charlotte stood at the kitchen window with the last of her tea and watched the garden that was beginning, in the tentative way of things that had been through a hard winter, to show the first indications of what it would become. Small, definite green at the edges of the beds, the particular stubbornness of things that had been dormant and were not going to stay that way. She heard Nathan come into the kitchen behind her. She heard him pour his coffee, the too hot, too black coffee she had privately reclassified from character flaw to idiosyncrasy, which was a different category, and come to stand beside her at the window. He looked at the garden. "It's coming," he said. "It is," Charlotte said. They stood at the window in the April evening, and the kitchen held the smell of the bread she'd made that afternoon, and the sounds of the house at its settled hour, and outside the window the garden was doing its slow, deliberate, seasonal thing. And none of it was dramatic, and none of it was uncomplicated, and none of it was what Charlotte Hayes had imagined her life would be when she'd stood in a parking lot in November with soup in her hands and rain in her hair and said okay to the future she hadn't been given the map for. But it was real. It was entirely, completely real. And standing beside the man who had looked at her in a doorway and made a decision that had nothing to do with debt and everything to do with the specific, rare clarity of someone who recognized, in one unguarded moment, what they were looking at. Charlotte felt the particular sensation of a woman who has walked through fire and loss and the worst versions of the people she loved and has arrived, improbably and without a clear accounting of how, at a Tuesday evening in April that was simply and honestly good. She reached over and took Nathan's hand. He looked down at their hands. Then he looked at her with the gray eyes that missed nothing and had been looking at her from the very beginning with more than they were supposed to, and he said nothing because there was nothing that needed to be said. Outside, the garden grew in the dark at its own pace. The lake was out there, vast and indifferent, doing its enormous thing. The city went on.